Emily Spieler. I'm the dean of the law school here, and unfortunately this morning I had to be at the university commencement exercises, and so I could not join you, but I very much asked Sonia Rowland to give me the opportunity to welcome you here, and I'm sure I'm adding my welcome to that of others that was offered earlier today. I am very struck that this is an extraordinary gathering of experts, and many of you have come from very far away, so I want to welcome you to Boston, to Northeastern University, and to this School of Law. First, I'd like you to join me in thanking the conveners of this meeting. Sonia Rowland, first, is a member of our faculty. She joined our faculty less than 2 years ago, and she has been making her mark from the second she got here. She comes with expertise in international law and regulation with a particular focus on world trade regulation. Dr. Rowland has been thinking about the issues of how to approach the problem of uncertain risk and the role of the precautionary principle for a while. Relevant to this conference, her article, The Precautionary Principle, Development of an International Standard, which was published in 2002 in the Michigan Journal of International Law, has not only received several awards, but its findings have been endorsed by the International Law Commission in a resolution by the United Nations General Assembly. Professor Rowland's current research focuses on the framework for development in international trade law. From the beginning, she has been collaborating with Dr. Makan Mbeng, who comes to us from the University of Geneva and who will be speaking with you tomorrow. I want to welcome Dr. Mbeng here and thank both of you, you and Sonia, for bringing together this extraordinary group of experts. This is an important conference in many ways, obviously, its subject matter. Northeastern University has a growing interest in issues that dwell in the intersections of disciplines, and there's certainly no more fascinating area for interdisciplinary inquiry than the problem of regulating new technologies. Here at Northeastern, there's been a specific focus on issues of nanotechnology, and you've heard from some of the people and are going to hear from more who work in this area. The NSF-funded Nanoscale Science and Engineering Center for High-Rate Nanomanufacturing and the NSF Center for Nano and Microcontamination Control. I think you heard from Dr. Ahmed Bouznena this morning. And from there to the highly interdisciplinary NSF-funded Nanotechnology Research Group, which involves engineers, social scientists, and philosophers in this problem of uncertainty. And there's also groundbreaking work supported by the NSF in nanophysics. This is the first time the law school, and again, thanks to Sonia for bringing us along, has joined with this extraordinary interdisciplinary effort, and I'm delighted that we've been able to do this. Our keynote speaker today is Christopher Bosso. Dr. Bosso currently is the director and principal investigator for the Nanotechnology and Society Research Group that I just mentioned. He has literally just, published an edited volume titled Governing Uncertainty, Environmental Regulation in the Age of Nanotechnology. Chris notes in his introductory chapter to this book that we look to government as the third party to analyze, mediate, and protect us from risk. Recent events, from the coal mine explosion at an A.T. Massey mine at Montcoal, West Virginia, to the BP oil spill in the Gulf, lend increasing immediacy to the question of what we can actually expect from government when risks are known. New technologies with new and more uncertain risks pose even greater challenges. This problem is exacerbated by the questions that underlie all regulation. Can the level of risk be assessed? Can the public understand the level of risk adequately? Do people fear new technologies too much or not enough? Is there a government role in managing public anxiety as well as the real potential risks? How much risk really is too much? How should we balance risks against the benefits of new technologies? When should government intervene? What are the effective regulatory mechanisms for this intervention? When should the precautionary principle have an impact on our acceptance of new technologies? These are all questions that Dr. Bosso has thought quite a lot about, and I'm delighted that he's been able to join us today as our keynote speaker. Chris.
get the slides posted. I'd like to thank Dean Spieler, leadership of the law school. I'd like to thank Sonia. She should say Bosso for organizing and inviting me. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my colleagues here at Northeastern, some who are assembled here. I'm a political scientist. I'm not a lawyer. There are a lot of things I'm not, but I'm a political scientist. And one thing as a political scientist that and when I'm trained to think about, and what I think about is this question of government. I mean, that's what we do. And I think a lot about, in democratic government terms, the role of government in any time, but particularly in a time of, I think, dramatic technological, economic, social change. And particularly during times when we're having pretty vibrant discourse about the role of government. And when I was asked to give this talk, I was reflecting about some of the debates going on in the country, but also some of the news we've been having lately about technologies. And I was struck by an America Online series that was, for some of those who were, I remember we were down in Washington a few weeks ago, about a month ago, at a National Nanotechnology Initiative Environmental Health and Safety workshop, and this had just broken like right before that. And it was from America Online, had an investigative series on the nanotech gamble, bold science, big money, growing risks. That's the title. That was the title of the series. I just want you to take a look. This is actually my encapsulation of the series. Nanoparticles can cause disease and death. Regulators are doing little to respond. That's an actual quote, by the way, from one of the subheadings of one of the articles. Nano foods coming to a store near you. That's an exact quote. Then I put in brackets, remember GMOs, anybody? NNI's National Nanotechnology Initiative's obsession with technological innovation and economic growth over safety. Again, something right out of the series. No U.S. agency leads nanotech environmental health and safety research. Companies can stonewall reform efforts. Not enough being spent on environmental health and safety research. Nanomaterial, and this is the last punchline, nanomaterials have not yet sparked the backlash GMOs did, but that may change. So from one perspective, the problem of nanotechnology is laying out. We know not the risks, we do not understand. We don't know the risks, we don't know a lot, and besides, a lot of people aren't paying attention anyway. Here's the official response. This is the response from the National Nanotechnology Initiative, the Nanotechnology National Nanotechnology Coordinating Committee organization that is Clayton Teague. This was actually, by the way, those of you who, some people might remember this, there was actually a set of talking points circulated by the NNCO to various people right at the time of this workshop. And these were the basic talking points, as in fact published by America Online later on. There's no evidence of harm by engineered nanoproducts, as contrast to the claim made over here that they can cause disease and death. The series wrongly assumes, and a lot of the series is based on looking at titanium oxide and other materials. The series wrongly presumes that nanotechnology is inherently dangerous until proven safe. And again, as a different kind of construct, if you will, about the nature of the problem. Besides, U.S. leads the way in EHS research, and in fact makes the claim, of course, $91.6 million spent in fiscal year 2010 for environmental health and safety research. By the way, earlier we had a slide about total U.S. R&D and nano under the National Nanotechnology Initiative, which was like $1.8 billion. So, I'll leave you to that to decide whether that's sufficient. And then fine, this is the sort of interesting takeaway from the official response. Risk must be balanced against benefits. And that the essentially theoretical risk that so far has been identified should be balanced against its benefits in terms of sophisticated products and economic growth and jobs created by expanding industry. Again, two very different takes on the same subject. And before I get to the problem in nanotech, I was reminded about a different technology of a different era. And I come back, because my first research that I ever did in this area was in pesticides. And I remember I was harking back to this question. Is DDT dangerous? Well, let's ask the question. Or is it a problem? What is the problem of DDT? Well, in the late 1940s, when DDT first got on the market, it was seen as a miracle drug. It was seen as a wonder technology. It was seen as key to winning World War II as much as the atomic bomb was. You go back and look at the literature from the late 40s. U.S. military said it saved as many lives as any other technology in dealing with airborne with diseases. And indeed, as a technology, DDT and its kindred technologies in the post-war organochlorine revolution transformed American agriculture, transformed the way we lived, transformed the way we, in fact, related to nature. So if you looked at media coverage of chemical pesticides after World War II, you saw an enthusiasm about a technology and its wondrous properties and what it could do to transform life. In fact, my favorite example is, I wish I had put the slide up there, was a slide from an ad in a Time magazine of a dancing cow, a dancing apple, and a pert housewife all going, DDT is good for me. You know, it was wonderful, 1948. All right, well, if 1948, if you had asked the question, is there a problem with DDT, you would have got, well, no. It's an answer to many problems. By 1970, if I'd asked that question, I would have gotten a very different response. Of course it's bad. We've got 20-plus years of experience and accumulation in various species in the food chain. DDT and its kindred chemicals were responsible for the degradation of especially bird populations, and all kinds of problems in the accumulation of mother's milk. And by the late 1960s, DDT was on the list of bad things. In 2010, if I ask the same question, I might get a little bit more nuanced response. And the response would be, it depends. Depends what the problem is. If you are in a developing country where malaria is a real problem and you've had resistance to other chemicals, maybe DDT is not such a bad thing after all. And so the question about the problem of DDT depended on the question of what it was for and how it was going to be used. And indeed, one could argue that the problem of nano, in fact, resembles a similar kind of construct about it depends. And I guess, and again, a lot of these comments are sort of my sort of free-flowing thoughts about the nature of problems. And it strikes me that we are at a point about nano when the real debate is about how we are going to define what nano means. You know, this question of how we frame nano. One of the things I think about, in a lot of things I think about, is problem definition. How do we define problems? And there's a great line by a political scientist, E. Schatzsnyder, going way back almost 50 years, who said, Schatzsnyder said, whoever defines what politics is all about has power. Well, whoever defines the problem has power. So, nano has a problem. Now, Andrew Maynard, and a couple of people in the audience I know would remember Andrew Maynard's point about this a few weeks ago at a conference in Minnesota, said that nano, in his mind, had become a class of a problem that he called the wicked problem. And that is a problem where there's no agreement among stakeholders as to what the nature of the problem is. Indeed, he actually went so far as to say that the definition of nano by the National Nanotechnology Initiative, the 1 to 100 nanometer scale, is itself a problem, maybe too limiting in terms of what it means. But what struck me about that comment was it really reflected also my broader thinking that nano, as defined as a problem, was itself a dilemma. I mean, how do we define nano? And one could argue that this contrast between the AOL series in the official view reflected indeed a clash between the drivers of innovation and the drivers of oversight. That is, there's very different, as with any technology, there are very different impulses behind the development for economic development purposes, for other kinds of purposes, and behind the impulses that are necessary for constructive oversight of the potential side effects. So I was playing around with this a bit in my head. So I asked the question again, what is the problem of nano? What is nano? How, and we've been fixated in the last decade about how new is it, how new is new, how revolutionary nano is. And I'm going to sort of flip it on its side for a moment and say, well, how revolutionary is nano as a problem, as an area? Maybe, in fact, we're defining it the wrong way. Maybe we're, in fact, asking the wrong questions. And again, I'm asking this from a purely, the most sort of policy construct way. How we define problems has tremendous power to shape our responses to the dilemmas we face. So let me play around with this. Again, this is just playing around with some ideas here. Let's take a taxonomy of challenges here. And I borrowed freely from my colleague, Ron Sandler, in ethics. A really tremendous ethicist. He's not here, so I can sort of say that. He's a tremendous colleague and ethicist. And he's thinking about this, we were thinking about this a couple of years ago, and he had come up with a nice taxonomy of challenges. And he said there are three kinds of challenges that we can think about. The ultimate and unfamiliar. And I flipped them in the order of far away and unfamiliar to the closest and most familiar. So the ultimate and unfamiliar, those challenges that we've never encountered before and can only dimly understand. I'll get into that, Intermediate and vaguely familiar, that is those that have arisen in the past in the context of other revolutionary technologies. So we've had some experience, and then we have some resource and experience for addressing. And finally, those that are immediate and familiar, challenges that commonly arise in the development and application of new technologies, and that we've had plenty of experience and resources, at least plenty of experience in addressing, and we have resources in addressing. So let's play around with that a little bit here. And I took it in order that I list here. Those that are ultimate and unfamiliar, the science fiction stuff. Self-replicating nanobots, the Michael Crichton stuff, the strong artificial intelligence, everlastingly long life, and on and on and on. The Ray Kurzweil kind of definition. And if you look at this list, you see a lot of, at least if you read over the last decade of talking about nano, you see a bit of truth here in terms of the way people talked about it sometimes. I mean, if you look at that list, you can find people out there who've said, yep, that's what nano's about. It's going to transform our lives. Revolutionary change. I mean, of course, Ray Kurzweil wants to merge the biological and non-biological consciousness, and he's going to try to live long enough to get there. And he's sort of what I call the sort of extreme version of this. But nonetheless, this is the kind of frame that goes on out there. But I don't think most people in this room would say that's really going to happen. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people out there who think about technologies in those kind of ways, just like they thought about DDT, transformative, revolutionary. The languages. I mean, think about the way we talk about biotech. Think about the way we've talked about a lot of technologies in the past, and this language of transformation and revolution. Hold that thought. Intermediate and vaguely familiar. Well, we do know, however, even as I tell my students, even if only a third of the predictions about nano's impacts come to pass, we're still talking about major impacts. People will live longer because we will, in fact, be able to address certain diseases. We will, in fact, so we will have impacts on human longevity and health, which themselves will have impacts on social welfare state questions, have impacts on social societal relationships, family structures, et cetera, and indeed have further impacts on the relationship between humans and nature. We know these things. These are not immediate necessarily, but they're something 20, 25 years down the road, we're going to be dealing with them. If people start living beyond the 80-plus years they're already living, they start living to 95 and 100 as a regular matter, that has huge impacts, and we know that. We know also that this relationship between humans and nature will be further affected through technology. We know that, but these are not things that we're dealing with right now. And yet, people talk about these things as major issues. I'm going to focus more on what we know. Despite the revolutionary language, despite the language about nano as unique and different and revolutionary, in a sense, it's a variation on a theme. We know that it will have toxic and chronic impacts. We just don't know what they are necessarily, but we know it will. Whatever it is, nano broadly conceived, which is probably one of its problems, by the way. What is nano is probably, in a deck, as I was telling my brain just froze. Gary Merchant earlier. A decade from now, will we actually be talking about nano, as opposed to materials, electronics, medicine, etc.? I don't know. I don't think so. That self is an important thing. But we know there'll be human health consequences because we have had experience with this in the past. We know there will be environmental consequences. We know there will be economic consequences. We know that there will be impacts in these areas, many of them immediate. And it's not because it's revolutionary and it's unique. It's because it's any kind of new technology has impacts. So we know, in fact, in some respects, we have a lot of understanding of what kinds of challenges we're going to be facing. And so I'm going to focus on this then. So which challenge do we choose to think about? Well, if we focus on the immediate and familiar, then I would argue that we know what the issues are. And we have a lot of experience going back 50 years. I mean, the one thing that I get frustrated by is this language as if the nano, broadly conceived, is somehow so different that we don't have any experiences in the past. Unfortunately, I suspect most people in this room don't believe that. But there are some of the stuff that you read over the years, especially about 4 or 5 years ago, acted as if we had never had, 40 years of experience since the first Earth Day in dealing with environmental problems. Act as if we've never dealt with chemicals. Act as if we've never dealt with materials or anything else out there. That's just on the environmental side. So, and if that's the case, if we define this as a variation on a theme, then we know that the issues are of a certain type. We have some extensive experience. We can address the most likely impacts and plausible risks now. We don't have to wait. It's not like the point is that we don't have to wait to address the most plausible concerns. We don't have to reinvent things. Now, if we're going to focus on the intermediate and more vaguely familiar, that is, those things that may happen 10, 15, 20 years from now, all right, well, we have a lot of historical analogies we can look at. We can sort of think about how would we situate ourselves. We can develop principles for risks that might raise the highest future concerns. And we can focus on building institutional capacity and resilience to deal with whatever comes down the road. But that's, again, a fundamental question about building capacity for the future. We don't necessarily worry as much about the specific risks because we don't know what they are going to be, but we can build capacity to think broadly about risks. But that's itself going to be tough to do. And then, of course, the ultimate unfamiliar, again, that's the far-off stuff. Well, all right, what do we do? Do we not think about it at all? Well, of course. What we try to do, at least, is focus on, I would argue we focus on governance regimes that are workable, responsive, and legitimate, that can adapt whatever the challenges are going to be 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And more importantly, conditions where citizens' trust is most critical. And this is important because, again, as Emily pointed out, as I often say to my students, whatever your ideological perspective, whatever your partisanship, at some minimal level, you expect government to protect you from those risks that you cannot either understand yourself or control yourself. I mean, there's a minimal expectation about government there. So, again, in any case, we need to pay attention to the broader issues of capacity along the board, but for different reasons. The problems of nano are really ones that we define as problems, in my mind. They're not served on a platter to us as fully formed problems. We are the ones defining what it means, whatever nano means in that sense, within a broader construct. So let's play this a little bit more. And this is, and even if we just are modest about this, I want to sort of play this a little bit, sort of unravel it a bit more. Even if nanotechnology, even in its most basic sense, and this is something Diana Bowman commented earlier this morning, exacerbates even the immediate and familiar challenges. And it's not because it necessarily is revolutionary and unique, I'll get to that point in a minute, but because, in fact, it's an additive thing at minimum. Let's think about nano as a focusing technology. Let's get away from the sort of revolutionary talk for a moment. Talk about a focusing technology and as a challenge to governance. There are uncertainties in any new technology. And what does uncertainty do? Well, uncertainties and the sort of concomitant lack of information about risk make it difficult to set priorities. That's the hardest part, I think. It makes it hard to set priorities. I mean, when we have known risks, we can start talking about prioritization. When we're uncertain about risks, it gets more difficult for everybody to even set priorities, design responses, and evaluate performance. It's hard. And in those kind of conditions, some fall back on sort of tried and true verities about, well, let the market decide on one end, or the sort of notion of a sort of pinched notion of precaution on the other. At least that's in certain definitions. And yet, in reality, there's a real tough governance question here. It's just how do we set priorities? How do we design responses? How do we know if succeeded? It's a typo there, but uncertainties may require granting some flexibility to the regulated. At the same time, that discretion is not in political favor. Or discretion creates accountability concerns. I mean, the odd thing about a lot of the technologies that we're dealing with today, not just nano, is that there are information asymmetries. There is, in fact, a degree of uncertainty in some of the effects, not just long-term, but short, even right now, which means a lot of times that regulators, those in government, are sort of forced to sort of rely a bit on the regulated for information or to figure out what's going on. And so there's going to be a degree to which there's going to be some delegation of authority here. At the same time, the more you delegate, the less accountability you have, or fear that you have. And that's, I think, a political question in some respects. It's how much do you delegate and how much accountability you try to build into the system. Do you have more flexibility but stricter rules for what happens if you sort of don't do the right thing? And these are dilemmas. These are not answers. These are more dilemmas. The promises of nanotechnology and its uncertainties force everybody out of their custom games in some respects. I heard earlier this morning that sort of conversation, and it's quite clear. The one thing about nanotechnology, as it's discussed, is that even the people who are concerned about effects admit there are going to be real benefits. It goes back to the DDT point. That is DDT bad or is it good? Were pesticides good generically, or were they bad? Because one way to think about pesticides was they were good things that had bad side effects, or they were bad things that had good side effects. Take your choice. But which choice you took really structured the way you thought about the problem. I mean, in and of themselves, they were not purely good or bad, dependent on what they were going to be used for, dependent on the context in their respects. I think the same thing's true of nano. Nano, in its broadest conception, promises real benefits. And yet, we know there will be impacts. Just go back to that slide about the familiar and the short. We know there'll be impacts. So it forces, to use all sides in these kind of debates, out of their familiar sort of long-standing sort of positions. If environmentalists admit that nano may in fact have environmental benefits, in terms of water and brown fields cleanup, in terms of helping people in their lives, in terms of energy savings, then what are they prepared to do in terms of dealing with potential risks? On the same side, if companies who want to, in fact, produce these products admit that there are, in fact, real concerns about potential toxicity, what are they willing to do in terms of perhaps being more transparent in the nature of what they're producing? Are they willing to, in fact, engage in a more of a grand bargain about risk? You know, I mean, that's one of the sort of debates that's going on in some respects. You know, are we willing to finally have an adult conversation in many respects about risk? Nano may force that in and of itself. And even if not revolutionary, the broad range of nanomaterials that are about to hit the marketplace, and already are hitting the marketplace, will overwhelm in many respects, stress, but if not overwhelm, regulatory systems and institutions. I mean, I think we're seeing it already. I mean, you know, I see Jeff Morris sort of smiling, but, you know, you don't have to have, you know, you don't have to think 5 years down the road to know that FDA, EPA, and all the other frontline agencies are going, holy, you know, that it's just, they're being overwhelmed already. By new applications, by new substances, by new kinds of arrangements. And Rick, at the state level, is sort of going, how do I grapple with this stuff at the state level? In terms of the, you know, at state levels, they're dealing with these sort of really proximate questions of air and water pollution, of waste streams, et cetera, at the local levels. So even if not revolutionary, nano, you know, does create problems. And, yeah. So, the problem of nano. So, but these problems take place within policy contexts, after all. I mean, it's not fixed in time. And I would argue right now is an interesting period in time because we, in fact, are at a moment, I think it's probably obvious, where the entire discourse is up for grabs again. I think it's quite clear, and I don't think this is any great insight on my part, that we are at the end of a 3-decade-long period of dominance of the free market deregulation narrative. I think that's pretty much, you know, that the dominance of that narrative, I think, is pretty well dented by the last few years. And so the question is, what is the new narrative about the proper role of government versus the marketplace? You know, that's really, I think, an important narrative that's going to take place, especially in places like the United States, with its dominant free market ethos. I think we are also seeing, as Emily Spieler commented about, citizen demands for more vigilant government in general will shape responses to emerging technologies. If citizens are more demanding of government attention overall because of concern that there's not enough government responsiveness, accountability, and focus on these kinds of risks, whether they're oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico, mine disasters in West Virginia, or any other range of problems from financial to other, you know, then this broader overarching narrative is going to focus attention on areas of new technologies because these are risks. So I think we are seeing, in fact, a different discourse happening already. You know, just yesterday, the President's Cancer Panel report laid out in no unambiguous terms concerns about government capacity, concerns about the effectiveness of regulatory regimes. It's not just about eating the right fruits and vegetables. You know, that individualistic narrative, you know, if you get cancer, it's your own fault because you ate the wrong things. Well, what happens if it's actually a much broader construct about the environment being so full of different kinds of chemicals that the sort of cumulative effect may, in fact, be really problematic for human health? What happens if that becomes a dominant narrative? What role then is expected of government? And, of course, new political realities. And the elephant often in the room in a lot of meetings I've gone to, nano meetings I've gone to over the last few years, is that no one dare speak of it, but, you know, administrations do matter. Different political actors do matter. Governments do matter. So the current administration certainly has a different view on this than the past administration. I can say because I'm an academic. But yeah, this is a government quite clearly less reflexively opposed to regulation. Because its perception is that voluntary efforts, for example, those in the, you know, a lot of ones that the EPA tried to foster over the last decade, did not pan out very well from its perspective, because industry, and all the industry associations tried, a lot of businesses don't want to release information. They're not inclined to volunteer information. So in fact, you may be in for, at least to some degree, compared to past decades, an era of more assertive government action across the board. So within that context, the problem of nano is going to be debated very differently than it might have been debated 5 or 6 years ago. And then, of course, further, connected citizens. One thing we haven't really talked about much is that we have citizens out there who don't have to wait around for governments to get information. Last time I checked, it's a little different. It's a little different now than it might have been 20 years ago. Citizens aren't waiting around to get information from anybody. They're scouting it out themselves. And they're talking about it with each other on the internet. Within an environment of networked citizens who are less trusting about all institutions, how do regulators that regulated proceed in their relationships? When you have citizens all over the place saying, they don't know what they're doing. It challenges the fundamental relationship, I would argue, between the regulators and the regulated in a way that we really haven't seen before. The mediated sort of relationships that traditionally had in political systems of interest groups, representatives in Congress, et cetera, that's really powerfully changed, I would argue, by the network nature of citizens these days. We don't know what it's going to be like, but we know it's going to change. Again, constraints and industry discretion. I think we're going to see more of that. Although, we're going to need some of it, but in return for greater accountability. Maybe, in fact, the movement for among some who want to change the Toxic Substances Control Act, the notion of no data, no market is taking hold among some members, especially members of Congress, the Democratic Party. You want to go to market on your chemicals, you better have the data. Because, you can have all the information in the world, but if government agencies don't have the capacity to handle it, what good is it? So you're going to see these debates happening. And indeed, the challenges posed by nano and other emerging technologies, so that biology comes to mind, is going to force a rethinking of regulatory approaches, I would argue. I mean, again, this is not revolutionary. People in this room think about it all the time. But it strikes me that we're having that conversation at a time that's very different than it might have been a decade ago. And I think what really strikes a lot of people is a real question. Even if nano isn't revolutionary, it still, in its cumulative sense, poses additive problems for a system already under stress. So what are we thinking about? This is some things we're thinking about, and I'll wrap it up. And it's quite clear, this again, not particularly brilliant insight, but we're going to have a lot of players here. A lot of agencies will be having roles to play in regulating nano. But if they continue to do so in the traditional siloed ways, at least in terms of the way they've dealt in the past, based on their statutory authority or just what happened to be the various media we're talking about in terms of air, water, or other kinds of things, it's going to pose problems. So there's going to be demands, I would argue, both at federal and state levels in the United States for more multi-agency kinds of approaches. That's tough, even in the best of times. That's very hard. So these network approaches to governance are also going to require more stakeholder involvement. But we don't know how to do that either very well. Everybody talks about it, especially when we talk about these sort of, how do we have more dynamic oversight systems, with more balancing of soft law, hard law, volunteers, and yet we don't really know how to do it very well. No one does. And so, as this quote from the IRGC says, the question is really how to move beyond simplistic notions such as self-regulation to building systems of accountability and governance that are conducive to the appropriate expansion of science and democracy. That's important, and yet hard, and yet essential to get right. And I would argue that that's the problem of nano. The problem of nano is not nano. The problem of nano is the problem of democratic governance. Because at the end of the day, if I want to really go to do a GMO analogy, The problem of technology, or the lack of citizens' willingness to accept a technology, is not the technology. It is the lack of faith and trust that those in government are able to protect them from the risks that they themselves cannot control. And with that, I'll leave that there. Thanks. Oh. And shameless plug division. I think we have time for questions. Great. And I'll be happy to take some. Rick. Sorry, we need the microphone.
That will give me a chance to think. It's always struck me that in this discussion that there's something really clear that's, to me anyway, it's like the elephant in the room that no one talks about. We keep talking about uncertainty. The solution to uncertainty is to get more information. Mm-hmm. So it seems like there should be a consensus around the need to immediately develop more information aggressively and assertively. Yet we haven't really moved in that direction. Can you speak to that and the barriers and the solutions?
And again, the question is about, again, need for more information. And again, some people in the room, especially the previous conversation we had about intellectual property, I mean, some of the barriers are, questions about the degree to which business wishes to protect its trade secrets. We know this from previous examples. We know a lot of these in areas of registering other kinds of substances, whether it's under TSCA or the Pesticides Act or other kinds of areas. We know that one of the great dilemmas is this sort of line between proprietary information and that information necessary to actually judge risk. So let's say for the sake of argument that we got past that one somehow. Then we have the problem of just the amount of resources necessary and who's going to pay for it to establish that something's risky. And frankly, at the end of the day, that's probably going to be the federal government in terms of its funding of basic research. Then the problem becomes, even if we had the information, how would we use it? I'm not offering a solution here. I'm saying that we really have intrinsic problems here that are not produced by nano. They're exacerbated by it. And I think the biggest problem is going to be this problem of proprietary information. Because I think regulators are going to be hard-pressed to know what risk profiles are going to be unless there's good information. And a lot of times good information is protected because of trade secrets or because of proprietary information, or in a different sense because those who seek to register products are not required to produce test data. And again, it's a broad spectrum of reasons, but I think that's an intrinsic problem of information asymmetries. That is, who has it, who doesn't. And even if you had it, what do you do with it? So I don't have an answer. I think you're right. That's a big. But let me point out one last thing here. We oftentimes regard information as if in a consumer vein. That is, we just give everybody a lot of information, they'll make wise decisions. It's sort of the labeling argument. And yet I wonder about that. I mean, what's the information for? Who's going to use it for what purpose? Because if all we're going to say is simply, well, let's put the information out there, let citizens decide whether this is a risk, then that's an abrogation of responsibility of effective governance. I mean, citizens don't know and won't be able to know what a risk is. It's not because it's stupid, because this stuff is hard. So, the problem of information is a huge one. How it's handled, by whom, for what purposes.
My experience dealing with the EPA has been, Nanterra is not required to do studies because we don't manufacture carbon nanotubes, so we're out of that loop. But I have talked to them, and they've maybe my perception is wrong, but my understanding is the EPA tries to foist the cost of studies onto private industry. Private industry expects government to underwrite that cost, and there's this sort of debate, and nobody's really doing it.
Sure.
Maybe I missed.
Sure. Well, the obvious answer is, well, then call up FDA and ask how that works. I mean, after all, if you want to register something through FDA, you got to pay for it. And so, yeah, we have a sort of an odd system where if I want to register something that's a drug or device through FDA, I got to pay for it, and I got to pay for the studies. well, somebody pays for the studies. Maybe your federal tax dollars go through university studies, but someone's paying for the money. It's someone's paying for it, and yet under EPA, it's the responsibility of government to do that. And so it is. I think there is a real question here about who's going to pay to generate the studies, and for what purpose. Emily, you want to add to that?
I didn't want to jump in.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you for your fresh perspective on the context of governance. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you described as the problem of the silo approach to regulation, and what chances there are to avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just a perception, obviously not again, dramatically new perception that we've had 50 years or so, even longer, of sort of the accumulation of agencies and statutes, and again, not surprising, every time we have a new kind of challenge, if you go back, most of our environmental laws go back to the 1970s, and they were passed in quick succession for different problems, whether it was pesticides or toxics or hazardous waste, all the alphabet soup of statutes. And we have agencies that evolved at separate times for different reasons as well. And so the question is, and this is, again, not novel to Nano, it's really a question of, after, let's say, 50 years of the contemporary age of regulation, if you mark around 1960s, the beginning of it, with like any good sort of path-dependent system, we've got a bunch of ways of doing things that are sort of embedded in history. And the question is, does this suit our needs? And I think there's a lot of agreement out there that we're not as well served as we could be by the fragmentation of authority across different agencies, by sort of the fact that we assign certain functions to the USDA just because we always did, or to EPA, or to all the. But the real problem is what to do about it. Terry Davies, for example, writes about the need for a new meta agency, as sort of a new meta kind of consumer protection agency that would merge together EPA, FDA, and that's one. Or we need a new nano. No one's really talking much about a new nano agency anymore, fortunately, because people realize that that's sort of not really a good idea. But the sort of real practical question is, how do you go about changing that? Is there really a need to? I mean, do we have a need for reorganization? Creating a new agency? I don't know. Gary Marchant in the back, and others have thought about, well, maybe it's not so much the regulatory question that we need to address, it's really the question of information. Maybe we need more analytical capacity. Maybe bring back Office of Technology Assessment, or some variation, a science agency that can do all the good science stuff and generate the information that Rick and others want. Come up with independent assessments of risk that the agencies can then use. The fragmentation is real because it's historically embedded, not because anybody designed it on purpose that way. But the question is, if we're looking at it afresh, how do we think about the future? And maybe, in fact, we can't take all this and redo it. Maybe that's just too hard. Last time we did, we got Homeland Security. I'm not too certain everybody's thrilled about that one in terms of reorganization. And yet, so the question is, what kinds of ways can we go about sort of networking these responses? Now, I don't know the answer. I'm just posing the question here. I think this is a real interesting governance challenge. And I'm just talking about the United States. I'm not talking about, again, within a global economy or in global discourse and regulation, where companies are also global and dealing with different regulatory regimes. This is not a trivial question. It's not just a U.S. question. So I'm not sure I answered that perfectly or even well, but
So I was wondering if we could unpack a little bit the question of costs and benefits, and the question of whether the costs are evenly distributed among subsets and whether the benefits are equally distributed among the subsets. And as you know, Chris, my area of expertise is far more in the occupational setting than in the general environmental setting, and it has always struck me that it's the workers at the manufacturing end who probably bear the highest risk, and perhaps the companies that own the IP who are set up to have the greatest benefit, and then there are a whole range of potential risks and benefits to different parties along the way. It seems to me that if we're going to think about regulatory intervention with regard to weighing risks and benefits, we can't just aggregate them and think about them as a single question. And I'm wondering how you've thought about it and how you think about the disaggregation of, in terms of the effects of risks and benefits.
I mean, we haven't thought specifically about that, but again, I go back to the slide about the immediate familiar challenges. You're right. We know these things we know that the first people impacted are workers. So is this a problem of nano, or is it a problem of justice, or is it a problem of, being fair to workers? That's part of a broader discussion, obviously. And I think the obvious answer is we know there are, in fact, we know that there are malapportionment of risks and benefits, oftentimes, if not always, in any production or any kind of technology. So the question is, and this is, I guess, I'm going to give you the totally inadequate answer. This is a real dilemma of perhaps justice. And it's not nano. It's actually the broader question of how we treat workers. And that's why I can't answer it, because it is, in fact, this is that's why I said nano simply exacerbates or adds to existing problems. Because if we already have a problem of workplace safety, or about the unequitable distribution of benefits and costs, nano adds to that. It's not a unique phenomenon in that sense. Yeah. And so we're not specifically dealing with that question, but yeah, it's a real issue. And I think but if I was being nano-specific for a moment, I would say that then the biggest and most important thing we do now is deal with workplace safety when it comes to exposure, and making sure that workers are not exposed. And that, in fact, is where I think if I was the federal government, that'd be the first place I'd be doing this right now, is really enacting pretty clear standards about workplace safety for handling nanomaterials. But again, that's, and then the broader set of questions flow from there. Who benefits is not, and who pays? And these are classic questions. And I don't have answers.
Dr. Bosso, I think this is a fantastic discussion. I feel like I'm back in law school.
I never went to law school. So.
Isn't the solution really something that we've seen before in a variety of technologies where the burden and benefit are all shared by a number of people? Take the electric light bulb. Mm-hmm. Thomas Edison, great inventor in the United States, had his invention company and stood to invent the light bulb. But over time, the government had a role in regulating the distribution of electricity to these light bulbs. The private industry had a role, and including the individual worker had a role. They have to work in safe environments. They have to make sure when they work on electrical things, they practice safely. Consumers had a role. They had to know, don't stick your finger in the light socket. That fundamentally you can't have government tell them not to do that. So isn't it kind of a same in the nano area, similar, where the risks as well as the benefits are shared by all?
Ideally, and that goes back to Dean Spieler's sort of question about equitable distribution of risks and benefits. Your finger on the light bulb point. Yes, we expect responsibility, expect people to act with some degree of rationality, or at least some degree of being informed, but we also want to make sure those light sockets are designed in such a way that you don't get shocked. And so, again, there's sort of that responsibility, and I guess I would put this in the sense of that's why it's important that we focus on democratic, again, political science, I think in terms of democratic discourse and democratic institutions. Because what happens is we smooth the edges, if you will, of the market system, the rough edges. We make life better for as many people as possible, not because capitalism is warm and fuzzy, not because markets deal out benefits and costs equitably, but because democracy demands at a certain point that citizens be treated fairly. And that's a question of, the distribution of electricity to rural America did not happen because companies wanted to do it. It's because government mandated it. And so if you're going to get a more equitable distribution of costs and benefits, or at least a broader extension of the notion of sharing, both benefits and costs, that's done because at a certain point citizens expect to be treated fairly as citizens. The whole healthcare debate in some respects is that debate. So I think, again, I try not to try to disaggregate, I try not to separate nano from the broader questions because I think it's of a type. If we have risks that are visited upon frontline workers for the benefit of society, what is the moral responsibility of society to make sure those workers are compensated or protected, protected in the first place, but compensated in the second place if they're somehow harmed? That's a moral responsibility. It's also a democratic responsibility. So, yeah. Gary, in the back.
Well, thank you for a very thoughtful presentation about our current situation. I was struck by your point of, 3 generations, sort of the free market, deregulatory model sort of coming to an end. And the reason we really moved in that direction, because a lot of concerns, the way we do command and control regulation, it's sort of inefficient at the margin, it's rigid, it's not adaptive, and so on. It seems to me there's a real danger of the pendulum swinging back and going back to 70s regulation. And nanotech would be the worst example to try and do that for because of how fast it's moving and so on. But I don't see a lot of other choices in there. There's got to be something else in between. And one of the problems, it seems to me, is that the way our agencies are structured and given their powers, that they have not a lot of flexibility. Things like the Project XL, which I thought was a great innovative idea to try and come up with sort of win-win solutions going outside some traditional statutory, sort of got struck down because it was going outside of statute. So have you given any thought to how do you sort of break through that and try and give a regulatory agency a little bit more flexibility to think of some sort of third ways and new approaches of this?
I mean, you're far more expert on this than I am, but the one thing that strikes me is that, again, if you go back to those 70s laws, they were written at a time when there was really strong reaction against corporations because of the first-generation environmental problems in many respects. I mean, the irony, in some respects, the irony is 40th anniversary of the first Earth Day was after the Santa Barbara oil spill. The 40th anniversary Earth Day, and so I'm not suggesting but you get the point that these laws were written at a moment when there was, in fact, the deepest sort of depth of suspicion about corporations. If you go back and really look at it. You'd be shocked by the language that was used during the authorization debates. Even you had Republicans excoriating corporate America for their malfeasance. Stuff you couldn't imagine listening to, except maybe some people. But you couldn't imagine some of that language today. So I think the real problem from the agencies is, in fact, we've locked in, we've locked in both through statutory sort of authorization that goes back 30 plus years. They haven't been changed at all. And of course, then court decisions that reinforce that sort of aridity of approach. That's sort of locked in. So the question is, how do we get around it? I don't know the answer, because the answer is Congress has to change the laws in some case. And yet, can you really imagine Congress changing some of our basic laws? Now, there's a movement afoot to change the Toxic Substance Control Act. This may be the best opportunity to do that in a generation, since it was passed in the first place. Would, in fact, that grand bargain be embedded in it? That is, companies get more flexibility in return for more information. That maybe would companies be willing to? The DuPonts of this world might. This is the point. Would companies be willing to produce more test data in return for more flexibility in how they go about managing their chemicals? Well, again, you have companies like DuPont who live in the global marketplace. They probably would be more willing. But the huge number of small companies out there that don't want to do this and who don't necessarily operate in the global marketplace may not want to behave like this. Remember, a lot of our laws are written. There was a point made earlier today, I think Rick made the point, that we often have exclusions for small companies or companies in certain sectors. Again, we have human beings called members of Congress writing laws. and they respond to their constituents. So I think in the Tosca's case, the grand bargain of more information in return for more flexibility is that opportunity. And if that doesn't happen, I'm not sure what will. I just don't know. I mean, one can only hope, and this is where I sort of pin my hopes. And again, that maybe we are at a point where I would hope, maybe until yesterday's cancer report came out from the White House, I was thinking about this, but that maybe we're finally on the verge of a more adult conversation about risk than we've had in a long time. Because we're going to have to be forced to acknowledge that there are benefits and risks to the things we enjoy in life. It's not a one-dimensional, and yet I don't know if we're going to have that debate now. I just don't know. Because in fact, enough people have got to be willing to say, the current situation doesn't work for me. Both government, government, advocacy groups, and corporations have to all sort of say the current system, the current situation doesn't work. And that takes political leadership. We may have that opportunity. It's maybe the moment, first time in many decades. There may be opportunity. I don't know. We'll see. Not until after this election, I don't think. The next election, we'll see.
In the interest of time, we have a couple people who've been waiting for questions.
Sure.
I'm just going to ask to both briefly ask questions.
Oh, I'm holding you between you and the drinks.
Mr. Bosso, if you don't mind just answering them both briefly.
Oh, I don't mind at all.
Please introduce yourselves. Yes.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. My name is Gabi Eigenmann. I work for the Federal Office for the Environment in Switzerland. And I really like that example with the DDT you made, or maybe we could say the comparison with DDT and nanotechnology. And since I'm a political science, I try to challenge you a little bit, and how we could also reflect a little bit further what has been done at global level with DDT. Finally, it has been regulated by an international convention, the Stockholm Convention, because it's a persistent organic pollutant. So what do you think would be the further towards the 21st century? What is your reflection with respect to nano at global level? Do you think that would be regulated as well with a convention? Or what is your reflection on that? And if you allow me to challenge you also with a second question, I see this presentation was made with, I would say, a national perspective to the US. Would you give this presentation in the same manner in Africa, or what would that be? How would you present it there with challenging the governments?
I mean, sure. I don't know if I can remember what the questions were.
Hi, Chris. Thanks a lot for a great talk. That was really fabulous. One of my favorite parts about it is that there's this deep irony in it, right? By definition, nano phenomena are invisible. We're talking about the nanoscale. We're talking about phenomena that occur below the wavelength of light that we can actually see. But you're kind of suggesting as well that nano's illuminating deep flaws in the system of democracy in this country. And so I want to come back to what you were saying about democratic discourse and democratic institutions, and just get you to say a bit about how critical public understanding of this science is, because it seems like sometimes you're saying that when you're concerned about the amount and quality of information that's available, you seem to be saying that that's information that's available to policymakers, but based on what you've written, I know you're concerned with the public more generally, so I'd just love to hear you say a bit about that.
Okay, let me go through the order then. My comments were directed primarily at the sort of national, with the recognition that it was taking place at a global level as well within a global marketplace. And it strikes me these same conversations are happening in Europe. They're happening everywhere in different guises. And the question will be, and I think it's a fascinating question the fascinating thing we're going to see in the next decade or so, is the degree to which we see a convergence in sort of the arguments about risk, about how we go about thinking about these kind of technologies and their impacts. You're going to have variations. There's no way around it. I mean, we do conventions on things that everybody admits. I mean, think about the global conventions we've had on things, CFCs, and DDT and a few other things. But those are rare. We create processes to deal with problems, and but it's very rare to get that kind of convergence. And so, I think you're going to have a lot of cross-continental discourse going on. I don't know if you'll ever. I mean, first of all, I don't know if you're ever going to see any kind of international or global framework on nano. I sort of doubt that. Like I said, I don't think we're going to be talking about nano in 10 years. I think we'll be talking about risks, but I don't think we're going to be talking about nano. So I know that there are these kind of conversations happening. How they will manifest themselves, I think, is anybody's guess. I think we do see a lot of discussion about. The one thing that I think strikes me is, again, this is an area that I'm only beginning now to think about, is the degree to which the notion of precaution, however conceptualized, becomes an accepted frame for thinking about balancing risks and benefits. It's not as, in many respects, that whole debate about precaution is not quite as abstractly one-sided in Europe versus the United States as we might think it is. It's a much more nuanced conversation than I think we recognize sometimes. So I think what's going to be a fascinating area of focus is the degree to which this notion of precaution, or appropriate precaution, perhaps, gets part of the global discourse. Would I give the same talk in a place like in Malawi? No. I might give a variation that says nano as a problem is based on what the conditions on the ground are. Just like GMOs. If I were advising a government in Africa about GMOs, I'd say GMO cassava sounds like a good idea to me. Because in fact it may address a real problem of a local food source that is under real pressure from disease and drought. Would I say GMOs are bad? No. Are they good? I couldn't say that either, but I'd say it's situational. So I guess my response is these are all situational. They're all contextual. That's my point about DDT. I don't think there are good technologies or bad technologies. There are technologies. How we use them is situational and should be informed by broader discourse about what we're doing with them, for what reason, and who benefits. So yeah, I would give a variation on the talk, but again, it would be the problem of nano from a different perspective. Finally, I'll end it on this, Michael's question about information. We like to think in this society that, first of all, more information is always better. That is, more information for citizens to understand nano and related technologies, synthetic biology, etc., is always a good thing. And certainly the National Nanotechnologies Initiative has tried hard through the NICE network and all the museums and all the NPR stuff. They've done, and all the stuff that's coming out. And for those who haven't paid too close attention, it's been an unparalleled effort by the federal government to try to inform the public about new technologies. And I wonder. And I don't wonder because citizens are stupid. It's because citizens are citizens. They pay attention to those things that matter to their lives most closely. Those are all good things. We should continue doing them, and probably more. At the end of the day, however, there's a sort of, what concerns me about this notion that we just need to give citizens more information. There's a supposition in there that if we give citizens more information, they will make the right choices. I think it's unfair, because we're asking citizens to make decisions about things that are hard to decide. In terms, they don't have, these are things of toxicologists. And we're putting an unfair burden on citizens to do things that frankly, their representatives should be doing for them. Whether they're elected representatives or those who are working in our frontline agencies. So I think to put the failures of, in some respects I have this view that if we put the failures of democracy, broadly defined, or of any kind of policy area, on the backs of uninformed citizens, that's terribly unfair to citizens. It's asking too much.